and let you know the meeting is being recorded, and to introduce our speaker, Jorge. Jorge Sánchez Cruz had the terrible honor of being proven right in real time. Writing on the correlation of the Latinx body in the US with various forms of excess, from biomedical disease to its social equivalent in terms of gender and sexuality, Cruz at once intuited and refuted Trump's political talking points even before the candidate won a bully pulpit for his primitive thinking. This critique of US ethnocentrism is paralleled by a transnational Latin American perspective that centrally frames queerness, transness, and their associated constructs in varying national contexts, specifically in Chile and Mexico, as in his dissertation from UC Riverside entitled Subcultural Politics, Sexual Dissidence, Sickness and Subversion in Chile and Mexico, 1986 to 2013. Jorge came to us as a participant in the prestigious new Emerging Voices Fellowship Program of the ACLS, one that seeks to support the work of recent PhDs within the ACLS Research University Consortium. Before teaching at Penn, Jorge was an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University. He's completing an ambitious book project entitled Aesthetics of Dissent, AIDS and Sexual Politics in the Americas. And he has also written on the political artist Teresa Margoles's work about violence directed against trans folk, on the relationship between undocumented status and debility, on deviance in Puig's great novel Kiss of the Spider Woman, and on the relationship between transvesticism and monstrosity in Mario Bellatin's Salón de Belleza. I hope this brief introduction will give you a sense of Jorge's range as a thinker, geographically, theoretically, and in terms of his material objects of analysis, not to mention his animating socio-political passions. Today's Work in Progress talk, a series of lectures devoted to scholarship in the making, is entitled Queer Dissension, AIDS, Sexuality, and Aesthetics in Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Jorge Sánchez Cruz.
Thank you, Jonathan, for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone for being here, taking some part of your time for being here. I am in California right now, and let me share my PowerPoint. So this is a kind of this is, of course, a work in progress, and these are ideas that I'm working on the relationship or intersection of Latin American sexual dissidence and queer studies or queerness, and how to build a conversation or a dialogue between them two. So I will start with two references of two sexual movements that kind of put into perspective where I'm going for and how I what is my point of departure, and how to read sexual dissidence queerly, or how to read queerness through sexual dissidence, if that makes sense. So dissension permeates these presentations as eruptions of critique and other ways of tapping onto the distribution of the sensible. However, and this is a question that I asked myself, how do these eruptions emerge, in what context, and what is their modality of operation? So I start mentioning Felipe Rivas and Jorge Diaz, founding members of the Chilean University Collective of Sexual Dissidents, or the University Collective of, or the Colectivo Universitario de Disidencia Sexual, when in 2013 in Hemisférica, a journal, they put forward a manifesto that situates the politics of sexual dissidence. For the Colectivo, sexual dissidence implies a critical approach toward the politics that govern our bodies, our subjectivities, that go beyond granting visibility to the issues that situate certain bodies as minoritarian or excluded, and which interrupt the hetero and homonormative logics of representation. The Colectivo emerged in 2002 after the Chilean state's ongoing local and global policies of multiculturalism, extraction, dispossession, and these different processes of violence on minoritarian subjects, indigenous peoples, and women as well. In their trajectory, the Colectivo have also proposed theories of queer and feminist aesthetic experimentations as political practices of resistance. That's how they mention it. That is through performance, public marches of disobedience, or video art, proposing a shift in making politics. Politics for the colectivo, it seems to me, or the way I read the movement, proposes to see what had no matter of being seen, shifting our senses to subcultural sites and embodiments who form no part in the consensus of the common. Verónica Gago and Diego Zoltwerk, also from the Argentine Colectivo Situaciones, have similarly described dissidence as a modality of political innovation and institutional critique, a process of immersion and insight perspective into the dynamics of crisis and invention from multiple positions. So I'm interested in that insight perspective, right? That within that the movement does, the Colectivo Situaciones, as well as the University Collective of Sexual Dissidents. One of those dynamics is of sexual dissidence, where the Colectivo takes us within dissident life to demand for trans, travesti, and gender nonconforming subjects rights, as well as indigenous peoples and other subaltern populations, and crystallizing what I call practices of dissent, that is artistic, literary, and cultural practices tethered to a social movement that enact institutional critique and which simultaneously develop strategies of political organizing and community making. So even though these movements are not Mexican, right, within the Mexican context, it allows me to position how I will approach the aesthetics that I will later, I will follow with. So in this talk, I will argue for aesthetic practices that are conjoined, tethered, and produced with and by sexual dissidents, participatory engagements with and within sexual movements, just as the Chilean Collective or the Colectivo Situaciones from Argentina. I argue that the aesthetic regime and its emanations of literary or as literary, visual, and artistic practices operate at distinctive yet correlative levels, from the failed hailings of the nation state through and with the momentum of the multitudes, and that shift our senses, our ways of seeing and hearing, to zones of objection where dissidents are conditioned by class, race, and in this context, by HIV and AIDS. It is in these trajectories that the aesthetic realm reflects and potentiates other political possibilities. So in what follows, I situate a way of reading, as I'm calling it a queer dissension, or a Latin American queer studies, followed by a glance into an archive of AIDS aesthetics or AIDS practices in Mexico, and finalizing on a close analysis of the work of the lesser known Mexican sexual militant, artist, and writer, Agustin Martinez Castro. So Latin American historical manifestations of sexual dissidence that have interrogated the idea of nation formation and the paradoxical constructions of the nation state to a state of modernity molds my proposal of dissidence, that destabilizing eruptive marker, also an embodiment, a movement, and a gesture, attachment to reading queerly. So I'm thinking about the attachments of dissidents to reading queerly, or vice versa. What are then the interdisciplinary possibilities of a Latin American sexual dissidence in queer studies? The Chilean Collective, for instance, while critiquing the vectors that regulate and manage subaltern populations, have set attention with US queer theory and queer studies, mentioning that even though sexual dissidence seems to share some beliefs with queer theories and politics, they reject the term queer as a word that grants an absolute meaning to critical practices in the local space of Latin America. So while they take a distance of queerness as a strategy for identitarian auto-representation, for it places sexually dissident practices under the queer nomenclature that ignores genealogical differences, they also emphasize a commitment to critical queer politics, for along them they envision possibilities of change in the representation of subaltern bodies. I take the Colectivo's resistance to queer as an all-encompassing concept, and yet its immediate commitment to critical queer studies as a mode of reading and engaging with Latin American non-normative sexualities and Latin American aesthetic practices, manifestations of sexual dissidence. So while the debate around translating a North American terminology to what has been termed the Global South is endless, my interest here is to show how Latin American sexual dissidence interrogates the subversive powers that operate under rigid identitarian models that also resonate with the global North's mechanisms of subjectivation. Diego Falconi, Maria Amelia Viteri, and Santiago Castellanos in their well-known text, Resentir lo Queer en America Latina, Resensing Queer in Latin America, have proposed the potentiality of resentir, the verb resentir, to resense. One related to feeling, to sense in a different way, the shifts and analysis to the complex and productiveness of queer embodiments found in the hybrid, heterogeneous, but contradictory space of Latin America. The other potentiality of the verb resentir, to resense, points to a resentment dimension that interpolates both academic fields, that of queer studies and of Latin Americanism, proposing a dialogue between both to expand on topics crucial to society that are not exclusive to queer subjects, but also to non-queers. So in short, queer dissension is a critical, as I'm thinking about it, right, a critical inquiry of analysis where Latin American sexual dissidence contaminates the field of queer studies. Queer dissension, in this sense, taps and holds onto the different localized and situated knowledges of dissidence of the continent and its aesthetic regime, aesthetic practices, but also more importantly, situates its own limitations, right? Kind of thinking about queerness as an auto-critique, right? In other words, at the heart of dissension lies an operative gesture that undoes and redoes what has been understood as queer, constantly reorienting our attention to brown, Black, trans, and minoritarian subjects. This is kind of like a subjectless critique that has been proposed, right, within queer studies here in the US, in which, when building a transnational conversation with Latin American sexual dissidents, fails not to sense the situated complexities of dissidence made manifest in aesthetics practices found in the continent. So here in what follows, I want to situate a queer dissenting reading on how to see archival formations, right? Or what are the desires of the archive and what is its occlusion, and kind of working along the occlusions, right? And in light of the first wave of the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Mexico, I suggest other types of reading and political possibilities that can emerge when reading queerly, or when reading along aesthetic practices queerly, Latin American dissidents queerly. In 2020, the University Museum of Contemporary Art at the National Autonomous University of Mexico opened an exhibition titled "The Zero Positive Files Visualizing HIV in Mexico" that collected works from the late 1970s to the 1990s and the present. So I put the link there. It's a big archive. It's a big file. The exhibition is the first of its kind that included poetry, photographs, installation art, newspaper headlines, performances, video, prevention campaigns, cartoons, propaganda, and some small articles, academic articles. The Zero Positive Files, on the one hand, this is the way I see the archive, right? The way I'm approaching the archive. On the one hand, is composed by pieces that reinforce the discourse of prevention, right? Such as Armando Cristeto's The Condom series, or Gabriela Figueroa Flores' photographic work that he did for Censida, the Centro Nacional para la Prevención y el Control del SIDA, or the National Center for Prevention and Control of AIDS. And on the other hand, the files, the way I approach it, again, is also constituted by pieces that rethink our engagement with zero positivity and the relationship between artistic practices and HIV and AIDS. So in the latter, we can see, for instance, Roberto de la Torre's Modern Kinetic from 1996, where in its inauguration, blood was taken from several volunteers and placed in test tubes on top of remote control cars that then drove around, crashed into each other, and then regrouped themselves once again. In the same vein, Hortensia Ramirez's Take a Picture of Yourself You Wouldn't Like to Look At from 1995 invites the spectators to visualize themselves as zero positive subjects. So while Modern Kinetic hints at how bodies and subjects are intimately bound to each other in different ways, that we can potentially caress, touch, right, and be in relation with each other. Take a Picture of Yourself intends, according to the Zero Positive Files, to sensitize the general public. So here again, we see the idea of resensing, right? It's something that I'm interested about in this project. These two pieces capture my attention, for they shift in some sense the regulative and normative predicament of zero-positive operation and exclusion to another sphere of imagining zero-positivity through artistic practices, right? Or another sphere of re-encountering zero-positivity. These pieces attempt, in my perspective, to shift how we narrate, visualize, and even be in relation with HIV and AIDS. Or put another way, these pieces point to other desires, forms of affect, sensibilities, and intimacies that can be derived when engaging queerly with praxis of dissidence that speak, murmur, and visualize the pandemic in a different light. So in this aspect, the zero-positive files as an archive occludes, if not forgets, praxis of dissidence that do not over-dramatize and do not over-represent HIV and AIDS, right? I'm kind of thinking what is excluded from the archive. So in my research, I came across a lesser-known project of Agustin Martinez Castro, who visualizes the pandemic differently. Born in 1950 in Veracruz, Mexico, Martinez Castro meets in 1978 the co-founder of the newly formed Homosexual Front of Revolutionary Action. So the Homosexual Front develops in 1978, 10 years after, in commemoration of 10 years after the 1968 student massacre in Tlatelolco, Mexico. The next year, he would collaborate in marches of protest, while also photograph the movements taking of the public sphere. So I'm interested how also his work operates within and in relation with dissident subjects, right, in the sexual movement. In 1979, Martinez Castro also joined a group of independent photographers, an artistic collective that interrogated the mass commodification and consumption of art creation and production. His project is found at this intersection of political engagement and aesthetic innovation or art production, collaborating not only with collectives, organization, but also proposing an aesthetic drift that resituates the relationship between art and HIV and AIDS, as I will show. So in Martinez Castro work, I see other desires, right, politically and aesthetically, in light of the viral dissemination of the 1980s in Mexico. I am pulled to Martinez Castro's work from the middle of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. His photographic project captures travesti, trans, and gender nonconforming peoples. He brings to light queer life, as in his series From 10 to 11 p.m., that catches and freezes a temporalized space and action fueled by transformation and desire. Desire, according to the Argentine writer and militant Néstor Perlonger, kind of summarizing, is a resistant vector that escapes rationality and formality. Right? So Néstor Perlonger was also an Argentine sexual militant and activist that participated in the movement in Argentina as well as in Brazil, right? And at the heart of his project, we see how he's thinking desire, right, in different modalities. I take desire in Martinez Castro's work as a queer impulse that detours from the normative and established regime, that then instead foregrounds the prolongment and survival of non-normative life. Martinez Castro's desire moves the narrative of AIDS panic to the trans and travesti spaces by proposing what I'm thinking as a constellation of a relationality of dissidence. This practice moves Martinez Castro to be with and around trans and travesti life, resonating also with his participation with the momentum of the multitude of sexual dissidents. This relationality of dissidence bifurcates in different intimate connections that I see as friendship, erotic, the sexual, the masses, and also the political. These intimate connections, motorized by a desire to be for one another, for the other, means on the one hand to be aroused and to be pleased, but also desire to potentiate and try to change the consensus that floods the social sphere, right, specifically in the 80s. These instances of intimacies are reflected in the images that follow and that ask what are the political and worldly possibilities when emphasizing alternative affinities, intimacies, or encounters. So Martinez-Castro's aesthetic drift, as I'm calling it, foregrounds conviviality and continuity to an intimate dissident relationality led by joy and desire. So while his 1985 series From 10 to 11 p.m. is an act that suspends the mass reproduction of misinformation, even the demonization of the viral dissemination, from 1985 and on, before his death in 1992 due to complication of HIV and AIDS, Martinez-Castro starts to abandon the documentary black and white style photography to experiment with non-conventional techniques of the time, like including Xerox images from photos taken from 35mm film. These collages as non-traditional images resemble the non-traditional spaces Martinez-Castro moves and cohabits with, or wherein he builds non-traditional intimate relationalities, such as his 1987 to 1998 series, Night of the Queen of Spartacus, that flirts with the travesti and trans dissident gaze, reorienting the assemblages of the viral panic to subcultural sites that undo gender expectations. So again, here we see joy and desire, right? Another form of desire. This is reinforced in The Winning Hour as seen on the screen, that emphasizes a travesti and drag joy and survivability. In The Winning Hour, Martinez-Castro emphasizes celebratory gestures and nuances of positive affect that reroute the negative registers circulating that coupled homosexuality or sexual dissidence with HIV and AIDS. The series, nonetheless, marks a shift from the black and white style to the implementation of color, as we see here, some color being included, that becomes more visible in the color illuminations of his series Marquesina, Tribute to Tito Vasconcelos of 1988. The color blocked images deploy a drag aesthetics influenced by the photographing of trans and travesti subjects, where the coloring signals a sense of the political that fails to reinforce the illegibility of non-normative subjects, and where color sensibilizes the spectator and the viewer to see the heightening of dissident desires and sexualities. The color suggests a dissident act that enhances the performance of the blurring and the destabilization of genders, positioning to the viewer the inherent intimate relationality of the normative subject to non-normative life. In other words, the legible and normal subject citizen is also constituted, perhaps yet unknown, right, on its intimate relationship to dissident sexual embodiments. This intimate relationality implies that one's actions and all lives are intertwined to non-normative dissident subjects cohabiting the most vulnerable spaces, which Martinez-Castro photographs in the bars, in the clubs, at the margins. The color, nonetheless, is an artistic rendition that emphasizes a radiation of queer life at the height of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Though subverted to private and confined spaces, I read color as a transformative act that translates also into taking on the streets, like Martinez-Castro did, undoing gender, and for grounding queer commonality, where what unites and connects queers following Jose Esteban Munoz is that precise feeling of non-belonging. So I linger on the 1987 series, The Lips of the Whole, taken at the Colonia Roma district that was partially ruined by the 1985 Mexico City earthquake, where Martinez-Castro juxtaposes decay, loss, and virality, interwoven with the tropes and gestures of intimacy, pleasure, and desire. Desire in this aspect can be read in different possibilities, as I've been kind of hinting or suggesting. Different possibilities of self-delight, and also in the artist's desire to visualize and narrativize the AIDS pandemic through color, pleasure, and a dissident intimacy. Dissidence or dissension, once again, insists on viewing and hearing the distribution of the sensible through a different optic. This optic is that of dissident intimate relationality that I posit Martinez-Castro proposes. So as such, the blue and white tones attuned to a door on the right with what looks like openings resemble that of a glory hole, where exploring bodies meet, caress, or potentially meet, caress, touch, and distort normative reasons, expectations of comportment and of respectability. Interestingly enough, the hole is a name of the street in the Colonia Roma district, where the artist finds a spot to brush strokes of paint and then photograph. The strokes are also the physical possibilities that may result in the intimate corporal encounters between dissident subjects. The whole opens, literally, figuratively, and politically, different possibilities of encountering the other, another desiring subject who may be in seek of sexual fulfillment, or that subject who is called upon to resituate the relationship between art, the virus, and sexuality. Indeed, the other is also that which is being interpolated not sexually or erotically, but ethically and politically to shift the ways in which sexuality and seropositivity are addressed. The lips and the mouth, this is the finding that is part of the series. The lips and the mouth, as shown on the right, goes along how to readdress the dissident other, that is to change, if not remedy and redress, the linguistic registers and imageries to which sexual dissidence and zero conversion had been contoured. So if in the 1980s and the 1990s emerged a discourse that made of HIV/AIDS a gay disease that heightened homosexuality as sin and as an aberration of God, and which made of zero conversion and zero positivity a precarious embodiment of dispossession and of disposability, here then in the mouth and the lips of the finding of Martinez Castro, the artist ponders, oh, this is the way I read it, right? Since he regularly wrote dissenting articles on the misinformation of AIDS, to shift enunciations in the vocabularies that have damaged, if not debilitated, dissident sexualities' lives. On the other hand, the lips found potentially on the whole, in the whole, the glory hole, literally the lips, can remain hidden, waiting for the next desiring body to appear. The erupting blue volcano signals that outbreak of sexual desires in the middle of ruins and loss. The fluids that erupt from the volcano gesture different modes of touch, invigorated by a dissenting desire to seek pleasure and fulfillment. Though this impersonal or potential impersonal intimate encounter may come to be seen as a self-shattering act, as Leo Bersani theorizes in Intimacies, even a destruction of the self by participating in these risky sexual practices, Martinez Castro differs in sentiment. After and during loss and destruction caused by HIV, the artist's exaltation of the blue and white with his proposal of desire and pleasure posits for other means to reimagine intimacy and to historicize the AIDS pandemic beyond the regulating and normative predicament of suppressing excessive embodiments, desires, and alternative ways of being for and with one another. Excess in this aspect or in this respect, as abjection is not sublimated or repressed in the work of Martinez Castro. It is instead that balance of difference that moves a recasting of excessive desire. So the lips of the whole canalizes its negative registers that have shaped sexuality and zero positivity, resignifying their meanings through what I have been proposing as a desire of intimate relationality. The whole as such is that opening the wound of loss, of fear, of pain, of pleasure. The whole is also an aperture in Martinez's Castro aesthetic project to rethink the relationship between HIV and AIDS and artistic practice. Or put another way, following Jacques Rancière and Sylvia Wynter, what does art do and what can it be deciphered to do respectively? Martinez Castro's speculative aesthetic gesture invites its viewers to see, feel, and hear the different possibilities of color, desire, intimacy, and pleasure when approaching an opening. What causes ruins and these textures of decay? What was lost here, and what are the repetitive possibilities to be done in spite of catastrophe, pandemic uncertainty, and sexual and somatic aberration? What are the lens and tools to embrace and be intimate with corporal alterity and sexual dissidence? The lips of the whole situates in this sense a dissenting optic that is at once a disagreement of the imagery around HIV and AIDS and a dispute on its distribution of in the social, through the social or in the sensible. Although the exhibition of the lips of the whole in 2018, there was an exhibition in 2018 was set up differently where the curator, Cesar González Aguirre, from the Center of the Image of the Government of Mexico, not only decided to exclude explicit images of the series because they are better left unseen, according to him. It is my perception that a queer reading or a queer dissension reading excavates precisely those blind spots that had not been seen and heard, but which constitute the aesthetic practices, gestures, and doings. So by contextualizing Martinez Castro aesthetic project, or his work as a cultural agent, we can see his involvement with the sexual movement, with the group of independent photographers, his conviviality within subculture spaces of queer life, and his desire to drift the HIV/AIDS narrative. At this crossroads, the viewer, spectator, reader is exposed to the different hidden implications of Martinez Castro's aesthetic project. Moreover, his photographic and artistic work reflects on that intimate distant relationality where he is with and within sexual militancy and in commonality that also kind of like proposes to the reader. So that commonality, which is that commonality that emphasizes a radiation of queer life affected by the HIV/AIDS pandemic. As an aesthetic injunction, the lips of the whole proposes to build other political affinities attuned not to the normative and juridical frames of citizenship contaminated by moralism and respectability politics, but to minoritarian sites of pleasure, desire, and intimacy that are not always sexual or erotic, but politically subversive. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. And we have the floor open for questions, comments. Well, I'll kick things off and then maybe others will join in. Oh, yes, Freya, please.
Here we go. I didn't want to like jump in immediately and be the first one here to ask a question, but it's pressing me to ask it. So lovely talk, Jorge. I really enjoyed listening to how your work has evolved. It's so stimulating and amazing what you're working on. I really like it. You mentioned Jacques Rancière, and you also mentioned Sylvia Wynter. And so I've been wondering, so Sylvia Wynter thinks from the perspective of race and decoloniality, and you might see this question coming now. So I'm just wondering, in your analysis of his artwork, where do you see, or how is race configured or not seen? How is the permanence of colonial racist forms of relating in Mexico configured into this work, made visible or invisible? And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Freya. It's a pleasure to see you. Yes, I think that is absolutely one reading that remains to be done, or that I'm working on, and specifically with the images that I have shown portray sexual dissidents as colored subjects, right? Or racialized subjects. And so one of the things that captured my attention about Martinez Castro's work is that, as you can see in the images, he was very involved with this underground, or as I've been thinking it through Munoz, right, of subcultural sites, right, where the most poor racialized subjects are cohabiting the most vulnerable, precarious spaces. There's definitely some work that I need to do on how Martinez Castro works that. But I think the way in which he travels into the Colonia Roma district, right, and also moves also to the most poorest racialized spaces of Mexico City, that we can see how there is inherent critique of the processes of racialization, right? And I really like that you brought up this question, because these images are definitely in connection with a different chapter that I worked on, Pedro Lemebel, this Chilean activist, writer, performer, and his chronicles on AIDS, right? Where am I attempting to do is build a dialogue. Now that you ask this question of how we don't really see a reading of race in Lemebel, right? But in his chronicles, there are two specific subjects that he emphasizes, right? There's Madonna Mapuche, and there's La Loba La Mar. So it's an indigenous and a Black trans travesti subject, right? And I can I can see how how Martinez Castro is also working along, perhaps not directly with Lemebel's work, right? How there's a critique of the processes of coloniality and or these frames of colonialism that are so present in both in Chile, right, and also in Mexico. And as you bring in this question, right, there's definitely a critique of patriarchy, right? What this patriarchy has left imprinted on both localized, situated spaces of Chile and Mexico. And I'm also glad you brought up this question, because this queer dissension, the way I'm thinking queer dissension, was inspired by this book called Dissensos Feministas by the Chilean, what is her name? I'm gonna look. Alejandra Castillo, I'm sorry. Where she's doing a critique of the different ways patriarchy has contoured the role or the figure or the space of the woman, right? So I think along feminist and queer theories, we can also develop an implicit decolonial reading, right? That has regulated or has mapped what are the spaces to be occupied by racialized subjects, and what are the spaces that are to be occupied or by non-racialized white upper middle class or middle class subjects. So thank you for the question. It's something definitely that I need to explore.
Other questions? Well, Jorge, could you explain something? As you were going on in your discussion of Martinez Castro's series, I was sure, absolutely sure, you were about to allegorize the earthquake to the eruption of AIDS in Mexican life, how it rent the fabric of the social, and that he was, as it would even seem that the title of the series would suggest, right, that he's trying to tie the two together in a kind of complex social historical allegory, but you didn't do that, and I'm curious why.
I think that is definitely a point that I need to expand, and I don't have time, right? And it's interesting that you bring this up, because the 1980s, as I see it, was, or as I want to describe it, was like Mexico in the ruins, right? The 1980s was a decade where Mexico was facing, not only did HIV/AIDS came around, right, but also the 1980s was where Mexico's economies was kind of like at the margins of ruins, right, that is a decade where the Mexican peso was completely devalued, where the government was trying to do all its best to kind of save the economy, right? And so through this process of trying to salvage the economy, also the HIV/AIDS pandemic, the Mexican government was trying to kind of like deal with like what are the different ways or reparative modes to kind of work through the HIV/AIDS pandemic, right? Devaluation of the peso, right? economic system going in sort of like ruins, right? And also the earthquake, right? So in the middle of all these ruins, right, Martinez Castro is producing all this beautiful work, right, where he is emphasizing radiation of queer and trans life. That is, in spite of all these processes, right, of ruins and decay, right, there is an eruption, right, going back to the volcano, eruption of desire and pleasure, right? And in some way, it's motorizing trans and travesti queer life, right, to continue on. Thank you for the question.
Sure. Thomas.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Jorge, for sharing your work. I apologize for keeping the camera off. I think that's bad Zoom form, so I appreciate your patience. But I've got two questions for you, Jorge. The first one in relation to the cultural objects that you're reading, this really fascinating aesthetics of dissent in. And I'm thinking not only because in Jonathan's wonderful intro, he mentioned your work on Mario Bellatin's Salón de Belleza, you know, a more literary text that's not, you know, perhaps as artistic or performance-based as the other things you're reading. So I'm wondering what, especially with your focus on the kind of interpretive holes and literal holes that these texts open up in with their aesthetic forms, what differences or similarities or different capabilities do you see between these more audiovisual performative texts and literary texts in relation to the aesthetics of dissidence you're talking about? And then this is a bit, you mentioned it in passing, the notion of subjectless critique as it's emerged in North American queer studies. I'm wondering your thoughts on how that, what happens when subjectless critique goes to Latin America? What happens when Latin American contexts are brought to bear on the notion of subjectless critique? So thank you.
Thank you, Tommy, for those wonderful questions. In regards to Mario Bellatin's beauty salon, right, and how I'm also utilizing using all the other objects, right, like photographs and performance and the chronicles in other pieces of this project. In general, I'm thinking about dissidence or dissension or different ways of seeing, right? So while Martinez Castro takes us to kind of shifting and drifting how HIV/AIDS is being portrayed, right, or being put into the image, right, how he's drifting that. In Mario Bellatin's, or the way I kind of read them both, right, Mario Bellatin's makes a sense or make us see in a different light as well, right? A different reading that appears that I do of Mario Bellatin's Salón de Belleza is that not only there's a critique of normative reason, right, or normativity that I find in the text, right, but there's another way of thinking hospitality and care in Mario Bellatin's, right? So Mario Bellatin's Salón de Belleza Beauty Salon is about a beauty salon transformed into hospice, right, where the main narrator or the main protagonist takes in those disposable HIV seropositive subjects who have been excluded of medical care from the hospitals, right? So in Mario Bellatin's Salón de Belleza, I argue that there is a different form of care, right, and different form of hospitality, right? But even though there are rules to enter the salon, the hospice, right, the text is de-idolizing the way we practice care, right? I think the narrator mentions, I don't know where, and I'm kind of quoting and translating it as I go. He mentions, I don't know where we have been taught that we always have to save the needed, right? So I think the text offers just a safe space for those in transit to finish, to die in peace, right? Rather than to face aberration and violence, right? And also one more thing is that the text, right, going along Martinez Castro's, right, how to shift those linguistic registers, right, or those representational images, right, of HIV/AIDS. Mario Bellatin's Salón de Belleza does a very interesting aesthetic move that instead of calling the patients, you know, like this very bad word, like sidosos or enfermos, the ill, the text hails or calls upon the sick as huéspedes or huésped, right? Guests or guests, right? So there I see, right, the relationship between shifting those shifting those registers, right? From the ill and sick to host the guests, right? Same as Martinez Castro, right? The way I read it along Martinez Castro, how he's also shifting also these images, right? So shifting the images and shifting the linguistic registers, right? How those two texts work, that idea of, but I'm kind of thinking like drifting, how aesthetics drift, right? In some ways and in different ways.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was thinking initially of that image of the fishbowl in the Salón de Belleza and how transparent that is and how that seemed like a different aesthetic modality in relation to these kind of dark holes that the other texts, like the Martinez Castro you were reading, it kind of lures you into. But now I see the ways in which they're similar kind of reorienting projects that present these different subjectivities and modes of relationality differently. If I can keep asking, I wonder your thoughts about the subjectless critique on a kind of hemispheric level.
Yeah, subjectless critique, and now recently What is Left of Queer, recently edited with David Eng and Joseph Puar, of objectless critique, right? I don't think Latin American sexual theorists, right, use these terms, right? But we can see it in some ways, right, in texts that have been appearing from the US, from Latin Americanists, right? For example, Héctor Domínguez Rubalcaba, right, published a text translating the queer, right, where he emphasizes a queer decolonial reading, right? In some ways there, he's emphasizing the conditioning of non-normative indigenous subjects, right? By different objects, right, that condition indigenous peoples. And his case is, that specific case mainly pays attention to the state of Oaxaca, of the mushes, of what has been called the third gender or non-normative subjects, right? But there are, I'm trying not to equal both or apply a subjectless critique, right, to how sexual dissidence in the South, in Latin American South, is theorizing what subjectless critique here in the US has been thinking or has been deploying. But there's still a tension. I think I want to mention this book that is coming up. It's called, it's by Felipe Rivas from the Colectivo de Disidencia Sexual, the University Collective of Sexual Dissidents. There's a book that is coming out that is called Say Queer with Your Tongue Sticking Out. And the subtitle is Latin American Sexual Dissidents from the South, right? I think there is an interesting, there's an interesting way, the way in Chile they're thinking how there's an impossibility of you know, if you try to say queer with your tongue sticking out, right? There's an impossibility of translating or enunciating it, you know, in more abstract and more theoretical level, right, to a geographical site, right? But there is a tension, right? But at the same time, Latin American sexual distance from the South emphasizes, if you go deep into that book, right, the different forms of subjects that are being conditioned by race, class neoliberalism, etc., right? But that is in tension with the global South. So I don't know, I'm very hesitant to equalize or equate both, right? Subjectless critique in the global South and the global North. But you can see like that they're both doing the kind of labor, right?
Yeah, thank you. That gives me a lot to think about.
Any other questions?
Hi, I have a question. So I saw this exhibition in Mexico City in January last year, before the pandemic, and I saw this aesthetic of families portraying this glamour way of portraying families back, you know, in the 19th century Mexico. And I was thinking of the late pictures that you show of Martinez, those coloring pictures. And I was wondering if there's a, and I also think about the Vogue ball scene, this way that they're mocking and worshiping um, um, certain glamorization. So I'll see if there's a connection between your aesthetic and Martinez, the way that he portrayed the scene in Mexico back in the 80s, and the ball scene, the Vogue scene in New York.
You know what? Thank you for the question, Marco. I have yet to do, I have yet to go much more in depth how that is being influenced in his work, right? I think perhaps it is because Martinez Castro started traveling to the US in the in 1987, 1988, right? In 1988, he traveled to New York, right? That's where he contracted HIV. In 1988, and while he was in New York, he was able to photograph the famous HIV/AIDS quilt, right? So one of his series is also him photographing the quilt, right, and those colorful images, right? So I would say potentially he was influenced, right, by the ballroom scene, right? If he was traveling to New York, right, and then he also did some workshops in San Francisco, right? And then he went. That's where he got all these new techniques, right, of collages and this color blocking in his photographs, right? I have yet to see, right, if he actually attended those ballroom scenes, but situating Martinez Castro as a transnational cultural agent now, I think that he may have been perceived, and we can definitely build a transnational conversation between the ballroom scene and the images of from 10 to 11 p.m. where trans and travesti subjects are getting ready, right, to perform or enact, right? So that is a very good question. I think that I will look into, especially when I visit some archives this June in Mexico City. So thank you.
Any other questions? Well, then please join me in thanking Jorge for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, everybody, for being here.